are some of the most important things you should know about when you start your flight training? In this video from Free Pilot Training, I'm going to explain some of the basic things you should know about when it comes to operating your airplane. What's up guys, I'm Josh and you're watching Free Pilot Training. Today we're going to be talking about operating an aircraft. And there's quite a bit to know about operating an aircraft. But before we can just jump in an aircraft and go fly, we have to make sure that those aircraft are airworthy. And one of the ways we can do that is to perform a good pre-flight inspection. A pre-flight inspection is exactly what the name implies. It's important for pilots to do a good inspection of the entire aircraft before we go fly. It's super hard to climb out on top of the wing and look over something after you're airborne. Yeah, you don't ever want to do that. In fact, you'll often hear these referred to as walk-around inspections because you should walk around the entire aircraft and look over everything really well. Especially on the first flight of the day, and to keep you from forgetting something on the inspection, it's very important to use the checklist that's produced by the manufacturer. Most aircraft have a detailed checklist in the pilot's operating handbook or the aircraft flight manual. But once you know how to properly perform this inspection, there's nothing wrong with going to a checklist like this, which is way handier to carry around in your flight bag. Anyway, these checklists are great because they can help you follow a logical flow when you look over everything. And that will help you ensure that you look over everything and you don't miss anything. Let's take a closer look at the pre-flight inspection in the POH for my Cessna 172H. Notice that Cessna tells you the most efficient way to perform this inspection, and I'm not going to read this entire checklist step by step, but I do want to mention that the checklist does not always include everything you should look at before flight. Now there is a note up here that says that you should check all the lights if you're performing a night flight, but what if the beacon isn't working and it's daytime? Can I still go fly? According to FAR 91-205, no you cannot. This is why it's very important for you to know your required equipment in addition to being able to determine if the aircraft is airworthy. That's why it's really not enough to do a quick walk around before you go fly. You need to check everything and make sure you're going to be legal and safe. My recommendation is to focus on the things you see in the checklist, but look at everything. If something's broken or not working, you need to ask yourself two questions. Is this thing required? And if not, what do I need to do since it's broken? I know you know what to do. We've talked about that in a past video. I'm going to make a separate video that explains how I like to perform a pre-flight inspection on a Cessna 172. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. But I do want to talk about a couple more things you should know about on the pre-flight inspection. Contaminated fuel is a huge problem for airplanes, and there have been many pilots who have lost their engine due to contaminants in the fuel. Because of that, it's important that we check the quantity and the quality of the fuel in our airplane during the pre-flight inspection. And the way we do that is by taking samples from the fuel tank sumps and the fuel strainer valve. These are the lowest parts in the fuel system that hold fuel, and we need to check all of these, not just one. That's important because fuel is lighter than water, so it sinks to the bottom. And that's mostly what we're checking for when we're taking these samples. Yeah, on occasion you might get a little bit of sediment as well, but water is typically the biggest problem. This is because fuel tanks can contain air in addition to fuel. As you may remember from our lesson on weather, the air in our atmosphere contains water vapor. And if that air in your fuel tanks cools off enough to reach its dew point, it can condense and form water droplets. If enough water droplets form, it can cause a decent accumulation of water in the fuel tanks. That's why we use a fuel tester. We're checking to see if there's any water in there and getting rid of it if there is. In addition to that, the same thing can happen in the fuel tank of the fuel truck at the FBO where you're getting fuel. These fuel trucks usually have filters and water separators to reduce the water in the fuel, but they don't always catch everything. That's why it's important to check the fuel before flight and after you've filled your tanks with fuel. Even if you've been flying the airplane and you're just topping it off on fuel really quick. If you do find water in the fuel, don't freak out. It's fine. Just continue to drain all the sumps and the strainer valve until you get all of it. Some manufacturers may recommend shaking the wings a little bit if you do find water in the tanks. That will ensure that you get all of it out, so be sure to check the POH to see if that applies to your aircraft. Now, one thing you can do to reduce the amount of water in the tanks is to top off the fuel and fill them completely after every flight. By filling the tanks completely, that reduces the amount of air in the tanks. If there's less air in the tanks, that's less air that can condense and form moisture. Remember, water don't burn too good.
It ain't got no gas in it.
Let's move on and discuss a few things you should know about when it comes to the engine, ignition, and electrical system on your training aircraft. Because you need to have a pretty decent understanding of these systems if you want to make good decisions during an emergency. Before you even start up the engine, another important thing to check during the pre-flight is the engine oil. Not only does it lubricate the moving parts in the engine, but it also helps keep the engine cool because it removes that friction between all those moving metal parts. Because of that, it's important to check the oil before flight and continue to monitor the oil throughout the rest of the flight. And the way we monitor the oil in flight is by using an oil pressure gauge and an oil temperature gauge if the engine is air-cooled. And these two gauges are so important that the FAA has made them required equipment items according to FAR 91205. As soon as you crank your engine and get her started up, the first thing you want to do is pull your power back to about 1,000 RPM on most training aircraft. This will allow the oil in your engine to warm up properly and spread the oil more evenly throughout the system. Once you've done that, you should look at all the gauges, but you should focus on the oil pressure and temperature. The nice thing is that you don't have to remember any numbers. As long as both of them are in the green, you're good to go. The engine temperature is going to start out low, but as the old girl warms up, it should get pretty warm, but it should stay in the green. But what should I do if my engine starts getting too hot? On the ground, you can just shut the engine down, but you don't always want to do that in flight, especially in a single engine aircraft. If the engine's getting too hot, sometimes the only indication is high oil temperature on this gauge. If you're flying an airplane with a liquid-cooled engine, those airplanes are not required to have an oil temperature gauge. They have to have an engine temperature gauge similar to what you see on the car that you drive. But it's important to keep an eye on both of these gauges because high temperatures can cause a decrease in engine power, and a lot of times the engine could start burning oil. And that could damage the engine and could even cause catastrophic failure. Remember, piston-driven or reciprocating engines rely on oil moving throughout the system to keep the engine lubricated and cool. So if you lose oil pressure for some reason in either one of these aircraft, it's very likely that the engine will overheat. So if the pressure isn't reading in the green, get the aircraft on the ground as soon as possible and top her off on oil and double check for leaks. With that in mind, there are a few other things that could cause the engine to overheat. And if your oil pressure's in the green, but your engine's still getting kind of toasty, these are some things to try. If you're on the ground, one thing that could cause your engine to overheat is if you sit in one place too long. This isn't really a problem if you have a liquid-cooled engine, but most trainers are air-cooled. So if you're sitting quite a while in one place, you only have the air from the prop to cool the engine. In that case, you might just want to shut down for a bit if she's getting too hot on the ground. Then you can restart the engine when you're actually ready to go. This isn't really the best option in flight though. I mean, I guess technically it is an option, but you're an idiot if shutting down is the first thing you try when the engine gets too warm. The first thing you should do is to think about some of the things that could be causing your engine to get too hot. If you're running the engine at a high RPM in hot temperatures, or the air is really thin because of high density altitude, these are some of the conditions that could cause your engine to get too hot. If you're climbing and this is happening, the best thing to do is pitch down a little bit and reduce your rate of climb. This will allow your airplane to speed up a little bit, which will allow more airflow over the engine, which will help cool it off. Remember, your training aircraft is probably air-cooled, so if it's not getting a lot of airflow, it's very likely going to get hot. Another thing that could cause your engine to overheat is if you have the mixture control set too lean. Now, we're going to talk about this more in a minute, but the fuel going into the engine actually helps to cool the engine. And by leaning the mixture, this allows us to get better power when the air is thin. But this also makes the engine hotter. So if your engine's getting hot and your oil pressure's in the green, the first thing you should always check is the mixture. And if you've leaned it out, there's a good chance it's too lean. Richen up the mixture and see if that fixes the problem. The last option is to reduce the power. This is not really the best option because fuel does help cool the engine. But reducing the power does also reduce the RPMs in a fixed pitch propeller. So that is something to consider. Before we move on, let's take a look at a couple problems that are often caused by an engine that is running too hot. Detonation and pre-ignition. Contrary to what you might think, gas does not explode in the cylinder to push the piston down and cause the engine to turn. It burns quickly and smoothly, and that creates the pressure to turn the engine. If it does explode, that is what we call detonation, And if that happens, it can damage the walls of your cylinder, the top of the piston, and all kinds of stuff. Now, as I just mentioned, detonation occurs when the engine is too hot. When the whole cylinder is too warm, it's way more likely for the fuel to explode. Because of that, if the engine is acting up and you suspect detonation, lower the nose and pick up some airspeed, or increase that mixture if you can. Cooling the engine off should keep that from happening. But to keep from damaging the engine, it's also a good idea to pull the power back a little and reduce the RPM. Pre-ignition is another problem that could occur if your engine's getting too hot. But this usually happens when there are spots on the cylinder that are red hot. These spots can actually ignite the fuel before the time is right. As you might imagine, this can bend rods and all kinds of scary stuff. But unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do because hot spots are usually caused by abnormal wear in those areas. Once again, you could have an oil leak or maybe a part got damaged from detonation or something else. In this situation, reducing power might help you out a little bit, but you should really get that thing on the ground as soon as possible and get the engine checked by a mechanic. Another system you need to be familiar with is the ignition system. And airplanes have dual ignition systems, one to keep the engine running and the other one for the wife and kids. Not only does having an extra ignition system make the engine safer and more reliable, but it also improves the performance as well. And that allows the engine to run way smoother. During the run-up, you'll be testing each system separately. And when you do that, you'll typically get about 100 more RPM out of both systems together versus an individual ignition system. Now, these are completely different than the one on your car. Both ignition systems on your aircraft have their own magneto, and those guys are responsible for sending an electrical charge to the spark plugs. The important thing to remember about magnetos is that they're turned by the engine, and they have small generators inside of them that can still send a spark to the spark plugs if for some reason the rest of the aircraft was to lose electrical power. That's good news for you because if the electrical system on your aircraft takes a dump on you, or you need to turn it off because of an electrical fire, you should not lose your engine. Anyway, that's why your airplane has a master on switch and a magneto switch. On most aircraft, you have to turn the master on in order to engage the starter. But once the engine is turning, you can turn that master back off and the old girl should keep running. Keep in mind, when we shut down our engine, the way we usually do that is to pull the mixture out. And the reason why we do that is to get rid of all the fuel out of the cylinders so we don't foul up the plugs when we're shutting down. But it's also possible to kill the engine by turning the magnetos off. Now, the magnetos are kind of special. You can't just turn them off. When you turn the mag switch off, you're actually not turning anything off. You're literally grounding out the mags so they quit sending a spark over to the engine. This is important to know because if that ground wire gets disconnected from the mag itself or the switch inside the cockpit, you will not be able to shut the engine down by turning the mag switch to off. This might not seem like a big deal because you can just pull the mixture out to kill the engine like you should be doing anyway. The real danger is when you're on the ground and the engine is not running. If that ground wire is broken or disconnected and you or someone else turns the propeller enough, the mags will send a charge over to the spark plugs. And if there's any fuel in the cylinder when that happens, the engine could kick over and possibly even start up and take off on you. This is why you should never turn the prop when you're doing a walk around. It's fine to touch it to check for nicks and stuff, but do not turn it. And once again, this design is a good thing. If you lose all electric in your airplane because your battery dies or your alternator quits working, you're going to lose all kinds of stuff. A bunch of your gauges will quit working, you'll lose your avionics, your radios, transponder, lights, and even possibly the flaps. But that engine will keep on going because those mags will continue to fire because they're being turned by the engine. And remember, if your plane has analog instruments, you still have most of those at your disposal as well. Now, there is one more advantage to this design. If you get stuck somewhere with a dead battery, it is possible to still hand prop a lot of these newer planes like they did in the old days. If you decide to do this, just be careful and make sure you have a competent pilot at the controls and not a passenger. Make sure they're holding the brakes nice and firm and use good communications to make sure someone doesn't get chopped up by the propeller. But the mags aren't the only things that are operated by the engine. A lot of aircraft also have an engine-driven fuel pump for the same reason. Once again, if you were to lose electric for some reason, an engine-driven fuel pump ensures that you can make it safely to the nearest airfield. And these are usually very reliable pieces of equipment. But we also have a backup for those as well. Some aircraft, especially low-wing aircraft, have extra fuel pumps that are operated electrically. And these can be used if the engine-driven fuel pump fails, and they're also often used to help start the engine easier. If your airplane has an auxiliary pump like this, the POH usually recommends using it for takeoff, landing, or maneuvering close to the ground. And that keeps you from losing your engine too close to the ground if the primary pump fails during that time. But you don't want to use these things the whole time you're flying. They're not meant for that, and they won't last very long if you operate them that way. With that in mind, high-wing aircraft like Cessna 172s or Piper Cubs don't usually have auxiliary fuel pumps like this. If the engine pump fails, those aircraft are designed to feed by gravity instead. Don't you just love all these little design features that keep you from dying? I know I do. Next, let's talk a little bit more about the propeller and some of the things you should know about that little guy. The propeller is basically a miniature wing that spins around and creates lift that pushes the airplane forward. This is what we call thrust.
Thrust! Other birds like ducks and geese, when they take off, what do they have? Thrust!
Just like the wing, the angle of attack on the propeller plays a huge role in how much thrust it produces. And if you want the best performance all the time, you really need a propeller that you can change the pitch or the blade angle. But that makes learning how to fly even harder. So we have what you call fixed pitch propellers in most training aircraft. And the angle on these are set so that you get pretty decent performance during climb out without giving up too much performance during cruise. I guess you could say that they're usually set at the best average, and you can actually buy props that perform a little bit better on climb or cruise, but if you want the absolute best performance, you need a variable pitch propeller. Now, I'm going to go into a lot more detail on variable pitch propellers in a future video. But let's talk briefly about these guys for just a minute because you can actually fly one of these once you get your private pilot's license. Keep in mind there are a couple different types of variable pitch propellers, but the one you're most likely to encounter is the constant speed propeller. Most of you guys have probably already seen airplanes with these propellers. In the cockpit, these typically have the same red mixture knob and the black throttle control that you're used to seeing. But they also have a blue knob that controls the speed of the propeller. And the way this system controls the speed of the propeller is kind of interesting. When the pilot selects a speed that he wants the engine and propeller to turn, the governor changes the pitch of the propeller to maintain that speed. For example, if I select 2,400 RPM with my propeller knob, if the engine is making too much power, the governor will increase the blade angle to slow the engine down and keep it from turning too fast. If my engine is producing very little power, the governor will turn the blades to a position where they're not creating much resistance, and this keeps the engine and propeller RPM at a constant speed. That must be why we call these constant speed propellers. What a great name. On these aircraft, when you move the throttle, you're basically creating more or less power in the engine. And the prop moves to keep the RPM constant, but the thrust you get is different depending on the speed of your engine and the power you have selected. High power settings on the engine are measured by a manifold pressure gauge like this. In fact, if you have a constant speed prop, this manifold pressure gauge is a required instrument per 91205. Anyway, high RPM settings and high manifold pressure yield more thrust, while low RPM settings with low manifold pressure yields very little. Once again, I don't want to go into too much detail today, but if you learn to fly one of these guys, there's something you really need to know. Anytime you operate the propeller and throttle, there's a very specific order that you want to do that. If you're increasing power, you always want to increase the propeller RPM first, and then increase the manifold pressure. If you're decreasing the power, you want to decrease the manifold pressure first, and then reduce the RPM. The reason for this is because if you run the engine at a high manifold pressure and a low RPM setting, you can very easily overstress and damage the engine. And you know as well as I do that the engine is not something you want to lose in flight. Okay, we've already talked a little bit about that red mixture knob in the cockpit, but let's go into a little bit more detail on that system. In order to get the absolute best power out of an engine, the fuel and air mixture going into the engine have to be the perfect ratio. Well, as you might remember, the air gets thinner at higher altitudes, so if we want to get the best power, we need to adjust the fuel-air mixture when we're at higher altitudes. Now, I've said this in the past, but your airplane does not care about true altitude. And there are actually a few things that can make the air thinner in addition to your actual altitude. Remember the 4 H's? High pressure altitude, hot temperatures, and humid conditions can reduce the amount of air that's going into your engine. Because of that, we need to lean the mixture when we're at a high density altitude. That's one of the reasons why we like to calculate density altitude before flight. That lets you know if you should be leaning on the ground or at what altitude you should start leaning the mixture. Now, if you read the POH in most training aircraft, most of them will tell you not to lean the mixture below 3,000 feet. I've seen some of them say not to lean the mixture below 5,000 feet, but if you're going to be flying at a density altitude above these numbers, full rich does not equal best power.
I'm your density.
In order to get the absolute best power for high density altitudes, all we have to do is adjust this little red knob. Now, do not ever just pull the knob straight back during flight. That would completely cut off fuel to your engine. That's why they put this little safety button on here to keep you from accidentally being stupid. Anyway, as you twist this knob counterclockwise, this moves the mixture back very slowly, and this reduces the amount of fuel going into the engine. This allows us to target the best ratio of fuel and air. Now, be sure to consult your POH for details on how to lean the mixture in your exact airplane. But typically, if you don't have an EGT gauge, the procedure is to reduce the fuel until the engine starts to run a little bit rough, and then increase the fuel flow slightly. I like to do 3/4 turns. Anyway, if your engine is running too rich, it's going to seem like it's running really rough. If you're experiencing engine roughness, leaning the mixture is probably the best thing to try first. If you run the engine too rich too long, this can also foul the plugs, so leaning the mixture might not always fix the problem right away. In fact, if you're taking off from a high elevation airport and you're noticing that she's running a little bit rough, but it's still passing the mag check, there's a good chance that this is your problem. It's not uncommon to need to lean the mixture on the ground in high elevation areas like Colorado or Montana. With all that in mind, you can also run the engine too lean. Now, if you go super lean, the engine will just quit running altogether. But before that happens, the engine will actually run too good. And what I mean by that is that your engine can get super hot. Remember what we talked about earlier? Hot engines are bad. You can get some serious engine damage if you're running too hot. Once again, check the POH and see what your manufacturer recommends so you do it correctly. With all that in mind, on the descent, when you're coming in for a landing, most POHs recommend setting the mixture to full rich. This is because you'll be operating at low power settings or even at idle during the descent. So there won't be a ton of fuel going into the engine anyway. But in addition to that, as you descend, the air gets thicker. If you don't richen the mixture enough, the engine could get way too lean during the descent and then kablooey. Just kidding, but the engine could get too hot if you forget to do this. This is actually one reason why some pilots believe that shock cooling is a myth. That might be something worth discussing in a future video. Now, a discussion on the fuel system just wouldn't be complete if I didn't talk a little bit about the carburetor and what we call induction icing. Before you can understand carburetor icing, you really need to have a basic understanding of how the carburetor works. Keep in mind there are a few different types of carburetors, and a lot of newer aircraft fuel systems are now fuel injected. But many training aircraft still make use of a float type carburetor to get fuel into the cylinders. And the way it does that is actually kind of interesting. The most important part of the carburetor is the intake. This is where air is brought in from suction from the engine. And as the air goes through the carb, it passes through a narrow passageway which causes a Venturi effect. As you may remember, when air is forced through narrow areas, this causes that air to speed up, and that reduces the air pressure in that area. When that pressure drops, it actually sucks fuel out of this float area over here because the pressure in the float area is higher. So I guess you could say that this system really sucks. Anyway, that causes the high pressure fuel to spray a fine mist into the cylinders, and that makes it burn nice and even to create the most power possible. Now, carburetors work really well, but they're also very susceptible to icing. And that simply means ice buildup inside the carb. And the reason for this is because of that Venturi effect that we talked about earlier. When air is forced through that narrow area, that air speeds up. Once again, we want that because that causes suction, which causes our fuel to spray in a nice misty fashion. But it also causes the temperature of that air to drop as well. And that temperature drop can be as much as 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember, the air in our atmosphere actually has water vapor in it, along with nitrogen, oxygen, and a bunch of other gases. This means that when that air comes into the carb, the moisture in it can freeze and cause ice buildup inside the carburetor. Keep in mind, carb icing can occur in a lot of different weather conditions, but you're most likely to experience carburetor icing when you're at a low power setting and the temperature is between 20 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and when there's a lot of humidity in the air. Remember these numbers: There's a good chance that these could show up again on your written exam or your check ride. Right now I can see you have a confused look on your face. You might be wondering how you're less likely to get carb icing if the temperature is below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Think back on our lessons about the weather. Remember, warmer air is capable of holding a lot more moisture. In fact, for every 20 degrees Fahrenheit increase, the air can actually hold twice as much moisture. So, at temperatures below 20 degrees, there's just not as much moisture in the air to freeze and build up inside the carburetor. Now, when ice does build up, it tends to build up in the throat of the carburetor and sometimes on the throttle valve. And that's because that's where the temperature of the air drops and causes that moisture to freeze. Because of that, when ice starts to build up here, the first indication of induction icing is almost always a drop in RPM. Think about it logically. If this throat is getting shrunk down by the ice, the engine is going to have the same reaction as if you're closing off the valve and keeping some of the air from coming in. So, let's say you suspect carb icing because you experienced a loss of RPM. Or maybe your engine isn't making the power you think it should be. If you're at a low power setting, you probably want to turn the carb heat on. When you do that, your engine is not going to start running better right away. In fact, when you first turn on the carb heat, you should always expect a drop in RPM. And the reason for that is because carb heat decreases engine performance. If you've already started your flight training, you've probably already noticed this when you test the carb heat on the run-up. This happens because the carb heat directs hot air from the engine or the engine exhaust, depending on the design, into the carburetor to melt that ice. Remember, hot air is thinner. That means that your engine gets less air when you operate with the carb heat. So essentially you're running your fuel-air mixture super rich. That's why we don't use carb heat all the time. It takes away some of your performance. I scared myself pretty good one time on a takeoff because I accidentally left the carb heat on during the takeoff and the climb out. That's definitely something you do not want to do, especially when you need all the power you can get. And that's the nice thing about these new fuel injected systems. You don't have to deal with carb heat and you don't have to worry about carb icing, but you're also going to pay quite a bit more if you want to purchase one of those guys. Fuel injected systems are for rich people. Even if you perform a perfect pre-flight inspection, there's always a chance that something could go wrong with your aircraft. I'm going to go into a lot more detail on this when I talk about engine out scenarios. But I do want to leave you with a couple things to think about since you could get asked about this on your written exam. The most important thing in every emergency is maintaining control of the aircraft. In fact, the Air Force actually teaches this as the first step in every emergency. After you get the aircraft under control, then you can analyze the situation. Take the proper action and land as soon as conditions permit. But sometimes you won't always be able to perform the rest of these steps. What if you take off and you lose your engine the second you're airborne? In a situation like this, it's very likely that you won't have time to do any of these other things, but you can still maintain control of the aircraft. Maybe I didn't check for water in the fuel like I should have on the pre-flight inspection, and now my engine cut out. Troubleshooting 3 feet above the runway is not what I want to do. Instead, immediately establish best glide, and then capture a good landing attitude and focus on getting the airplane back onto the runway. If you lose your engine on the takeoff roll like this, just land straight ahead on the runway, even if you do have a tailwind. Yeah, you're probably going to float a little bit because you have a faster ground speed, but there's not much you can do about it. If you lose your engine and you're out of usable runway, plan on landing the aircraft straight ahead. Do not turn around unless you're 100% sure you can make it back. Many people have died because they've misjudged their ability to make it back. I'd like to discuss this more in a future video, but until you know for sure, plan on landing straight ahead, even if it is in the trees or something. Once again, in this situation, it's extremely important to capture best glide. This does 2 things. First, it allows you to glide as far as possible before you touch down. Second, if you maintain a constant airspeed, this will allow you to judge exactly where you're going to touch down, which will help you put the airplane down into a more favorable landing spot. If you let your airspeed move up and down, it's going to be impossible to accurately determine where you'll touch down. And at that point, you might as well just close your eyes and hope for the best. Don't really do that. Once again, we're going to be talking more about emergencies in a future episode. But this is enough to get you through the written exam and get you thinking about the things you should be thinking about when you start your flight training. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please smash that like button for me. I've got 2 videos left in this series and my private pilot ground course is complete. When that next video is done, I'll throw it right here. Thanks for watching, guys. See ya!